When it comes to multiplayer gaming, a lot of people think about the Nintendo 64. It was a great system for split screen and competitive gameplay, but how does it hold up when it comes to co-op games? Let's just do this in alphabetical order, and I'm gonna skip the sports games, because I can. Armorines, Project Swarm. This is a first-person shooter where you and a friend team up to fight various aliens. Every level has its own objective, and it's not just linear. You're gonna have to explore a bit to find switches and items and keys to move forward. This is one that I've always ignored, and that's because I couldn't quite figure it out. But this time, I actually made a little bit of progress and got a bit further into the story. And the first-person shooting gets broken up at parts with some on-rail segments as well. It's definitely not the best co-op first-person shooter on the system, but I think it's solid. Army Men Air Combat. This one you can play in split screen co-op, where you and a friend each take control of a green helicopter, and you fly through and shoot down various army men. Each level has different objectives. Sometimes you just need to eliminate all the enemies, sometimes you're gonna need to pick up an item and transport it somewhere else, and then like in this level you have to protect this train from enemies. This one is a pretty decent co-op game. Battle Tanks Global Assault. This one is a vehicle combat game, kind of similar to Vigilante 8 or Twisted Metal, but this one moves a lot faster than those games. You're gonna spend most of your time in a tank, going around and taking out all the enemies, but sometimes you can change your vehicle. Usually the objective is just to eliminate all the enemies, but there will be other objectives as well. And overall, this is another decent co-op game. Bomberman 64, The Second Attack. This is the era where they really started to try to experiment with the Bomberman formula. And in this one, they added a story, so it's not just like a multiplayer focused experience. At the beginning of the story, you find a character named Pommy, and the second player is able to control him. He's mostly just an assist player, so it's not the best co-op experience on the system. He can mostly just stun enemies, which can be helpful for Bomberman to drop a bomb and then explode that enemy. However, Pommy can't even participate in the boss fights, so that's kind of disappointing. But later on in the game, Pommy is able to get different upgrades, so he can become more useful. Overall, I do like the concept here, but I wish that it was a little bit more equal. Then we had Bomberman 64 in Japan, and this is different from the US version. It's a totally unique game. Now this one you can't play through a story mode in co-op, but it has two different co-op options. First, you have the tandem option, where you and your friend are basically doing like a tag team approach. I've never seen this in a Bomberman game before, and I liked it. One player does all of the moving, and the second player drops bombs, and then you're able to switch roles. I really like this approach, and it actually requires a bit of cooperation and communication. And then the other option is more of a standard Bomberman gameplay style, where you can do a team battle 2 against 2. When you think of Bomberman on the Nintendo 64, this one never gets mentioned, so I'm glad I found it. Diddy Kong Racing has a hidden co-op mode. If you go into the options, you're able to put in codes. If you type in joint venture, then you're able to play through the entire story mode in 2-player co-op. And this works really well. Basically, as long as one player gets first place, you're both able to move forward. However, in the hub world, only one player does the driving. The second player is only available during races, and he can't participate in the boss races. But when it comes to co-op racing games, this one is definitely one of my favorites. And overall, it's just one of my favorite co-op games on the Nintendo 64. Duke Nukem 64 is a port of the first-person shooter PC game Duke Nukem 3D. But the N64 version is a little bit different from the PC version. The main change is you can play through the entire story mode in 2-player split-screen co-op, and this makes for one of the best co-op first-person shooters on the system. So if you haven't played it, definitely give it a try. Fighting Force 64. This really isn't different from the other versions of Fighting Force. This is a fully 3D beat 'em up. For the most part, I don't think that 3D beat 'em ups work that well, especially in this era. But there's something about this game that I still really enjoy, even though it's slow and clunky, and the graphics are just ugly. Playing this with a friend can be a lot of fun. I love that there are so many weapons that you can pick up to fight with. You can even bust up a car and throw the tires at opponents. Gauntlet Legends is one of my favorite games from my childhood. We would always have sleepovers and play through this game with 4 players. And when it comes to Gauntlet games, I really think that Gauntlet Legends is way better than the original Gauntlet games. For one, it no longer uses your health as a timer and just slowly decreases over time. I hated that. But this game holds up surprisingly well. It's just a really good dungeon crawler. And of course, it's even better when you play it with friends. Goemon's Great Adventure. In my opinion, this is the best co-op game on the Nintendo 64. First of all, there are very few 2D platformers, and I think that was really missing in this generation. Just everything about this game is great. Platforming feels great, the visuals are pretty decent for the time as far as 2.5D visuals go, and the characters all stand out and have their own unique abilities. But it's not just a straightforward platformer. You're gonna need to go into towns, and when you're in towns, it becomes a 3D game. And you're gonna need to go around and talk to various people in these towns to figure out what you're supposed to do next. It's not just a straightforward linear experience. I love the Goemon series, and this is probably my favorite in the entire series. I played through this game a number of times in my childhood, and I still think it holds up really well, which is honestly kind of rare for the Nintendo 64. But not enough people talk about this game, and like I said, I think it's the best co-op game on the Nintendo 64, period. Hexen is another really great first-person shooter, but this one has a fantasy theme, and you can play through the entire game in 4-player split-screen co-op. This game was also released on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation, as well as PC, but the Nintendo 64 version, it was the only one that had split-screen co-op. And it also had a more consistent frame rate, and overall, better visuals. Although playing it in split-screen, it switches over to a low detail mode. I don't know why this game kinda has a bad reputation. At least the Nintendo 64 version, I think it holds up surprisingly well, and I think it's one of the best co-op games on the system. Jet Force Gemini. This is a game made by Rare, and it's definitely a departure from some of the titles that they're known for up until this point. This is a fully 3D action platformer / third-person shooter experience with a huge story in a huge world and a really great soundtrack. I was obsessed with this game when I was a kid, and I still think it has a lot going for it. But the camera and the controls did not age well. But one of the coolest features is there is a co-op assist mode. Pretty early on in the game, you get to a part where you have to collect all of the pieces of Floyd, the robot. Once you do that, a second player can now take control of Floyd. Unfortunately, this is just an assist mode. He can't participate in a lot of things and is ultimately just a little cursor that can move around and shoot down the enemies. That being said, if you do have a good partner, doubling up your firepower can be incredibly helpful. It's not the best co-op experience because it's not equal, but I still think that it's unique and definitely worth trying out. Knife Edge Nose Gunner is an on-rail shooter, and it can be played with up to 4 players. Basically, the camera takes control of itself and navigates you through this environment. Each player takes control of their own cursor with a unique color, and you basically just shoot everything in sight. The visuals here are very ugly, and the gameplay becomes repetitive and boring very quickly. You don't have control over anything other than the cursor. I think it's worth trying out if you're just looking for any kind of 4-player co-op experience, but it's definitely not the best experience. And it just becomes pretty boring pretty quick. Perfect Dark is basically the spiritual successor to GoldenEye 007, but once this game came out, I never went back to GoldenEye because this game just did everything that game did, but in a better way. Primarily the variety of weapons, and the deathmatch allowed you to include bots, so that added some variety as well. But the main upgrade that this game had over GoldenEye was that you can play through the entire story mode in split-screen co-op. And still, to this day, I think that this is one of the best co-op first-person shooters ever made. Of course, the visuals are very dated, and the frame rate takes a huge hit when you play it in split-screen. If you're able to look past the technical problems that this game has, underneath is a really great first-person shooter. I played this game for countless hours when I was a kid, both in deathmatch and in the campaign mode. It's definitely one of the best co-op games on the system. And yet another first-person shooter, we had Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. I'm not gonna lie, this is a series that I don't know much about. I did not play this game back in the day, and playing it now, I don't know if I'm just not used to how these games function, but to me, it's not very enjoyable. I know that they are going for a more realistic approach for the time, unlike Perfect Dark, so the game moves much slower and you can die much easier. But in my opinion, this is just not a great co-op game. Let me know what you guys think about Rainbow Six on Nintendo 64. We also had Rampage World Tour. This is pretty much a remake of the original arcade classic Rampage, where you play as various monsters and you just destroy everything in sight. City buildings, you eat humans, and you destroy vehicles. That's basically it. There's nothing deep about it, and it becomes pretty repetitive pretty quickly. But I remember when this game first came out, I wasn't familiar with the old Rampage games. So this was my first experience with the series, and being able to play this in 3-player co-op with my cousins back in the day, I really enjoyed it. We played this game for hours. I think the concept is really fun, I just don't think there's enough substance to keep you entertained for a long gameplay session. But if you have a couple of friends with you, it's definitely worth trying out for a quick pick up and play. And then we had Rampage 2, and basically this is just more of the same. Almost nothing has changed. The gameplay is pretty much the same. There's just new characters that you're able to play as. I just don't have much else to say about this game. Sin and Punishment came out exclusively in Japan. This game isn't necessarily known as a co-op game, but you are able to split up the tasks of controlling your character, where one player controls the jumping and movement, and the other player takes control of the shooting. And I think that this works really well as a co-op experience. I always knew that this mode existed, but I never really spent too much time with it. While capturing this footage with my friend, I think that this makes for one of the best co-op experiences on the Nintendo 64. And honestly, Sin and Punishment is one of the few Nintendo 64 games that I think really just holds up. Ignore the visuals, but the gameplay and everything, it's just so fast paced, the controls are really tight. This is honestly just a really great experience, and it's one of the best on-rail shooters I've ever played. So if you haven't played this with a friend, I highly recommend you try that out. How about Space Invaders 64? This is basically the same old Space Invaders gameplay with a fresh coat of paint. You can play through the entire game in 2-player co-op, and it doesn't really do much of anything new other than you can get some new weapon upgrades. But the one thing that it does add is boss fights. So basically you play through 10 levels and then you have a boss fight at the end, and then you go on to the next world. I think the boss fights are the best part of this game. Each one is big and has its own unique patterns that you're gonna have to learn. This is a decent game. There's nothing special about it. It's worth trying out at least once. StarCraft 64 has a unique co-op mode where you can play in split screen. Basically, you just team up and you build everything together. You have shared resources, so you're gonna need to communicate and decide who's gonna build what. Ultimately, I don't know much about the StarCraft games, so when I was playing this, I didn't really know what I was doing most of the time, and we just died. But if you are more familiar with the StarCraft series and have some more patience than I do, I think that this is actually a pretty solid experience. Turok Rage Wars is kind of weird when it comes to co-op. It doesn't have a dedicated co-op mode exactly. Basically, you can play through the Trials mode in 2-player. However, when playing through the Trials mode, not every single match is co-op. Sometimes it's just a death match. I don't really understand this. And as you progress, some of them you will be on a team, and you have to team up and fight a boss specifically. Or you just team up against other various enemies. I still wanted to mention this one. I wish that the entire Trials mode was co-op though. I don't know why they did it like this. Ultimately, it is a really good game. Vigilante 8 had a pretty decent version on Nintendo 64, and you could play through the entire story mode in split-screen co-op. However, playing story mode in co-op is kind of weird. When you get into the menu, you will see Versus, Cooperative, and Quest. You're gonna wanna go to Quest, because if you go to the cooperative mode, it'll just do a single match, where you and your friend team up against other AI opponents. This is not the story mode. You're gonna need to go to Quest, and then you can play through the entire story mode in split screen co-op. Every single time I boot this game up, I always screw up and click the cooperative mode, so I just wanted to give you the heads up. But yeah, this is a vehicle combat game similar to Twisted Metal, where you're gonna choose your vehicle. Sometimes there are some objectives, sometimes you just destroy all the enemies. This is one of my favorite vehicle combat games, but I think that the Dreamcast version is a lot better than this one. And then we had Vigilante 8 Second Offense, and this is pretty much just more of the same, but slightly more refined, I guess. I don't know what else to say about this. If you enjoyed the first one, you'll also enjoy this one. Now let's talk about some unreleased games. First we had 40 Winks. For years there was a prototype of this game floating around, but then years later, Pico Interactive took this game and actually released it. So there is a physical version of this available now. 40 Winks is basically a 3D platformer, and you can play through the entire game in split screen co-op. Basically, you're gonna go into various worlds and you have to collect a bunch of stuff. The visuals here are just so dark and everything is really difficult to see. It does look a little bit better if you're playing it on a CRT as opposed to a flat screen, even with an upscaler like I was using here. But even on a CRT, this game, it's just very hard to see what's going on. And like a lot of 3D games from the era, there's a lot of camera problems and control issues. But I don't think it's a terrible game. It's definitely worth trying out, especially for the co-op mode. Dragon Sword is a 3D beat 'em up, and this game was never finished. There's a prototype that's been floating around for a while, and I've booted it up a few times. Ultimately, it's clear that this game was not finished. Every time I try playing this game, it crashes on me. It's not a great 3D beat 'em up, but I imagine if it was in a more finished state, it would have been a lot better than this. I heard that there are rumors that this game was going to get finished and have a new release, so hopefully that does happen. Now how about some co-op homebrew games for the N64? The first one I want to talk about is called Squidlit 64. Now this game has not been released, but from what I've read, it's supposed to be a 4-player action RPG with split screen, similar to Phantasy Star Online on GameCube. That sounds really ambitious, so I'm really excited to try this one out, so I hope it does get completed. And the next game is called Telocation Gemini. This one came out in 2020, and it was made for a competition known as the 64 Brew Game Jam. This one actually won first place for that competition, and I could see why. This is actually a really great game. The visuals look really nice and stylized. Basically, it's a 3D platformer, where one player takes control of the astronaut character and the other player takes control of the robot. You have to play through a few levels before you find the robot, but this game was clearly designed with co-op in mind, as each puzzle requires both players, so you're gonna have to communicate and work together to get through the levels. This is just a really great game, and it's pretty polished for the N64. I highly recommend you try this one. The popular homebrew Xenocrisis that originally came out on Sega Genesis has been ported to a number of vintage game consoles, and one of those was the Nintendo 64. The gameplay is about the same. It has a great soundtrack, excellent visuals, and twin-stick controls. And this actually works really well with the N64 controller. You could use the D-pad on the left and the C buttons on the right. If you haven't played Xenocrisis yet, you could play it just about anywhere, including modern platforms. But the N64 version is another excellent port. Now I want to talk about some co-op hacks. These are games that were originally single player, but hackers in the community actually added co-op gameplay to them. The first one is Bomberman 64. This is the original US version of Bomberman 64, and now you can play it in co-op. There's a really excellent co-op hack for Mario 64, and you can play through the entire game in split-screen co-op, where one player plays as Mario and the other plays as Luigi. This is so impressive, and if I didn't know any better, I would think that this was an official release. It was just done that well, and honestly, I've always loved Mario 64, but I always wanted to be able to play it in co-op. So I'm just really glad that this exists, and honestly, this hack is one of the best co-op experiences on the entire system. This one's a little difficult to pull off. It's not just a hack, you have to actually do a cheat code, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. But if you're able to pull it off, you can actually play through the story mode in co-op on South Park 64. And this is not a great game, but playing it with a friend definitely makes it more fun. And the last game I want to talk about is WWF No Mercy. And this is another one where you're going to need the Game Shark to put in a code to unlock. But yeah, this allows you to play through the entire story mode in co-op. I'm not that familiar with wrestling games in general, but this one was pretty cool to see. Okay, so there you have it. That's every single co-op game for the Nintendo 64. Did I miss any? And just remember, I'm not including sports games. That was a choice. I did that on purpose. Don't tell me about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, check out our video about the top 30 co-op Super Nintendo games. And thank you for watching.